Big cup and hello. Welcome to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. One of our earliest episodes that we did previously was a discussion about the pressures facing gifted students specifically. But this week, we're going back to school to talk about how education is handled in the series. Gilmore Girls has everything from high school dropouts to Ivy League graduates, but they're not all necessarily portrayed in the same light. So what are the writers trying to convey about formal education or the lack thereof? And how do we view education as a society? Is our view too elitist and optimistic, given the realities of our educational system?
Before we get started, this is your reminder that this is a spoilers all podcast. And if you could smash that like and subscribe as an offering to the algorithm gods, we would greatly appreciate it. All right, let's get into the synopses.
Yep. Kicking it off this week, we have episode 5 of season 2, Nick and Nora, Sid and Nancy. And it's Rory's first day back at Chilton and the start of her junior year. But Paris still hasn't gotten over the Tristan issue. And as a means of revenge, she lies to Rory about the start time for the first meeting of the school paper, which causes Rory to be late and to sign the most boring piece about the repaving of the parking lot. But the joke is on Paris when Rory knocks the assignment out of the park. And because of her success, she's given a better story, interviewing the favorite teacher from the previous year, who just so happens to be Max Medina. Meanwhile, Luke receives a call from his sister Liz that she's sending her son Jess to live with him because he's been getting into some trouble and she can't deal with him. Lorelai invites Luke and Jess over for dinner with her, and Rory and Suki and Jackson are a welcoming party, but Jess is surly and disrespectful the whole time, which gets him off on a bad foot with Lorelai. The only person he seems to take a shining to is Rory.
Season 2, Episode 6 is presenting Lorelai Gilmore. Rory agrees to participate in the DAR debutante ball at her grandmother's request. Christopher comes back to town to present her, and Dean begrudgingly agrees to be her escort. There's a spark between Lorelai and Christopher as she notices that he's gotten his life together more since we saw him last, but he reveals that he has a new girlfriend. Richard is going through a rough time at work, believing he's being phased out of the company and forced into retirement, which causes strife with Emily as he cancels on their social engagements. Yeah, so as we mentioned in the opener, we have an entire episode on gifted students specifically, so go back and check that out. That was one of our first episodes, actually. And then in the future, in July, we're going to tackle university applications. And in September, we'll be talking about university experiences. But this conversation is a more general and will probably focus more on secondary school with a little bit of post-secondary thrown in there. This show is, in a lot of ways, founded on the premise and the promise of education. And that bleeds through so many storylines, characters, and themes. So, the entire premise of the show and nearly all of its drama springs from the belief in higher education. We wouldn't have the Gilmore Friday night dinners or family drama without the arrangement to pay for Chilton and later Yale. And a lot of Rory's plot revolves around her school and her assignments and her interpersonal conflict with her schoolmates. So I thought it would be a good time to talk about this because this is the episode where we meet Jess, whose school career is interesting and kind of different from some of the other characters. He's the only one who doesn't finish high school and go off to college, despite the fact that he's probably one of the smartest on the show and could have his pick of schools if he decided that dedicating himself to higher education is the path that he wanted. So, the ethos of the show is that education is the path. It's so formal education centric with Chilton, Harvard, Yale, talk of Lorelai dropping out of school, the judgment against Chris for not going to Princeton, Luke and Dean being looked down upon by the Gilmores, and so many other instances of just judgment against people who don't follow that path. So I wanted to look at that and we'll come back to it in a little while. But, I want to see if the writers are correct about that. Is education the path? But we're going to start with a slightly more general question just to get the conversation going.
Okay.
And it's not a hard question or anything. Is the educational system, and Chilton specifically, really preparing students for life?
My answer is going to be different for both. Is the educational system on the whole, I think, preparing students well? I will say yes. Is Chilton preparing students well? I will say not really. Not as well as they think they are, which is key there because they think they're doing a good enough job, and not as well as they could be. And I think for the context of this conversation, we're obviously going to be focusing on the American school system because Rory goes to school in Connecticut. You know, and you might have a different system, up in Canada, and you might have had different experiences. But I think it's important to focus on the American school system and its flaws and its positives. So that's where my answer lies. I think on the whole, the American school system, yes, does a good job. And I think it's such a complex question to answer too, because I think it's also largely dependent on where you live, where you grow up. Are you in a good neighborhood? Are you being sent to a school that's in like a, prosperous suburban area? Are you in a lower class, like urban city area that's not great? And it's really going to vary in that regard. I have a lot that I can say about that too. But again, on the whole, I think the American school system does a pretty decent job of preparing the youth for life. I think Chilton falls short, and I don't even think that they want to accept that they necessarily are not preparing their students as well as they could be. And I'll get into my reasonings for that too. But no, I don't think Chilton is doing a good enough job with the students that they're having for the 4 years that they're putting through the system.
Interesting. I almost thought you were going to go the opposite way. And I might go the opposite way. But yeah, I totally concur as well that this particular discussion will center a lot on the American system, despite the fact that I'm Canadian, because it's kind of easier to find information about your system. And there's a lot out there on your history and your graduation rates and information like that out there. And it is more pertinent to this particular TV show and discussions about it. So good point. The Canadian system really isn't that different from the American system. I think we took a lot from you and also some from the British as well. So, I mean, duh. So, yeah. I don't know that school prepares you for life. I think school prepares you maybe for more school. And sometimes not even then. Like, I remember going from high school to university and, with the entire pedagogical system being very different, being a lot more self-driven, you have more choice of electives and you're responsible for getting yourself to class. And if you don't show up, that's on you. You're not, unless you have some very particular professors, you're not going to be punished necessarily directly for skipping out on it because the classes are typically large. And so you're just sort of one face in a pool of many, and the profs almost never notice. But even then, school as we have it now, where, you you show up and the first bell's at 7:30 in the morning and then you just go from class to class to class, that is not how real life works most of the time. Your education system specifically, ours would be a little bit different and sort of delayed as we picked up things from other places. Yours was sort of derived in its current form around 1893, 1894. There was this committee called the Committee of 10 that was chaired by Charles Eliot, who used to be the president of Harvard. And so, yeah, one of the smarties at Harvard was one of the initial proponents of sort of the standardization of high school curricula. And not only that, but articulating that curricula with what colleges were looking for, what universities were looking for. So more of a nexus between the two systems so that school would actually prepare you for college. So this Committee of 10, they call it, made a bunch of recommendations about how school should be set up. And so this was 130 years ago, basically. And it hasn't really been updated substantially since. And when it has, it's been sort of stuttered, like implementation of different things based on certain recommendations. And not only that, but very politicized ideas of what school should teach and do and be. So it's been this sort of like piecemeal change over the years based on a variety of circumstances. Like there's a lot of change after World War II, and the philosophies changed quite a bit around that time in terms of using schools as a venue to teach kids good old American values and how to fight the commies. So the system itself kind of came about at a time when we were shifting from a really agricultural economy to an industrialized economy and society. So the structure of it, with the rigidity, the obedience, the discipline, was imposed at a time when most people would go onto a factory job, you know? So most factory workers didn't need to know how to speak Latin or read Latin or do AP calculus or anything like that. So it's just, it maybe has not been updated for what we now know about human flourishing and psychology, like flow states, and how meaning and purpose can drive learning, and technology, innovation, collaboration, all of these different things. School has not historically been good at teaching us how to do those things well. It's just, kind of encouraged us to get our butt in a seat and listen to an instructor for a couple hours at a time, and then sends us home to do homework, and then rinse and repeat, right? So a lot of us don't necessarily use those skills anymore on a daily basis. And the things that we're taught content-wise are also no longer maybe keeping up with what we actually need to know. Like, I don't remember jack about what I learned in high school, maybe like a whisper of it. But for the most part, it's all gone. They teach you how to memorize and teach you how to take tests. And then, so what we're really measuring is how good you are at taking tests. But when you're out in the real world, what does that get you? Most of the time, you're not being asked to do rote memorization. So are they teaching us the skills we need to actually succeed? Are they teaching us how to cook, how to do taxes, how to perform first aid? There's all these useful skills that we could be acquiring in an institutionalized format that are, sometimes they're offered, they're electives or are required for other things, like maybe a teenager is going for their lifeguarding, and so they take first aid and it's available through the high school. But for the most part, these are not required things. You have to sit through the Common Core, basically, the math and the science, the biochem, physics, all of these subjects that you never use again, because we live in a technical digital age where we no longer need to know how to do complex math, because our computers can do it for us to save us time, so that we can use our brains for the things that only our brains can do, right? So I'm not entirely sure that schools have done a good enough job catching up and incorporating the knowledge we have now about how students perform the best, and what skills they actually need to be functional members of society. I think back to the kinds of courses that were offered at my schools, and I feel like the offerings and the requirements were paltry compared to what I need to exist as an adult today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I know when I was in high school, there were electives. I mean, and they were electives. So like you could choose to take them, you could choose not to. I did, just because they interested me, and I thought they were useful. But like I did take a life skills course, and at that point they were still teaching you how to like actually write out and balance a checkbook. And I mean, I don't need to do that anymore because, again, digital age. But they, taught you like, how to do laundry, how to, again, balance a checkbook, how to file taxes, basic things like that, where if you didn't know how to do it already, and I did, but there were still things that I learned and I picked up. You could learn. There were food course electives where they like taught you how to cook and how to bake, and I just, even now thinking back to it, it's like that's so much more useful than me taking algebra 2, which I don't remember a thing about. I've never used it a day in my entire life. Ask me the cosine of what that triangle is. I don't know, and I don't really care because I'm never going to need to know. But, how to maybe cook like pasta, more useful than algebra. So yeah.
Well, you are Italian, so
yeah. Well, yeah, I've also been
very
like,
relevant
cooking.
knowledge.
Yeah, but I was also, I think, probably I came out of the womb knowing how to do that. So
that is fair.
But yeah, case in point, like teach kids how to prepare meals for themselves, how to file taxes, how to do laundry, how to, I don't know, even communication and socialization skills. Like that's going to be so much more helpful, I think, to your average student, again, in this day and age, than perhaps advanced math, which unless you're going into a field like engineering or something with like science and technology, you're not going to need that. So why make a student waste their time on that when that's not going to be useful or helpful to them? So in that sense, yes, I think the school system needs a slight overhaul, a revamp, but it also boils down to acknowledging and figuring out what each particular student's interest is, what they see their career path being, and then trying to tailor an education to them based on what they feel like they want to do in life. And that's easier said than done a lot of the time, especially when you are in a school system that might be short on teachers, that might be short on instructors, that might not have those same offerings, and they just don't have the means and the capability to do that for individually, for students. And that's sad, but that's the reality, I think, of a lot of school systems, especially in this day and age, and especially in underfunded and just low income and urban areas where the money's just not there for it.
It's very true. I mean, like I said, it's not an easy problem to solve or an easy thing to know how to deal with. But I think incorporating what we know now about child development and teen development, adolescence, it can be improved, but it's not going to be easy. And like you said, it's going to be resource intensive. But even then, Chilton is a private school that they pay an exorbitant amount of money for. And it's still just kind of this old school conservative idea of what an education should look like for the most part. I mean, it doesn't look like what I did at school. It does have some elements that I've noticed that do seem more conducive to actually learning and engaging and things that will actually be useful. Like I'm thinking of the time that they had an economics project where they had to design and produce and market a consumer product. Like that actually seems like something that they could use, especially if they want to go into business. Not everyone wants to go into that, but it's a useful set of knowledge and skills to have, right? I don't think, maybe my first high school had it, but I don't recall entirely. But my second high school certainly didn't have an economics class. There was geometry and vectors, there was data and probability, and there was calculus. None of which, well, like data and probability is a little bit useful. The rest of it is crap. And it's difficult to grasp and it's useless unless you're an engineer. So Chilton, I think, is a bit of a step up from some other types of instruction where it really is just a teacher talking at you because the class sizes are too large for them to really give any individualized attention to students. But I think Chilton still has this sort of blanket set of standards that applies to every student that isn't necessarily as helpful as an individualized learning plan might be, or some sort of consideration of the sheer variety of professions that students want to get into, which also makes me think about the fact that we try to force young people whose brains are still not fully developed to choose a life path to follow so early, and then they don't realize, how unlikely it is that they're going to stick with that job for the rest of their life. And it makes them feel bad when they want to change their minds about it. And so a lot of the time, people who take a gap year before going off to college are more likely to graduate. They're more likely to follow through with the path they set for themselves. And so I think we're putting too much pressure on kids to perform to a certain set of standards and to pick something early and to take all the courses to get an impressive job that, chances are good they're not actually going to pursue in the end anyway.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that you could ever see a day and time, like even in the future, when Chilton modifies their curriculum to incorporate those types of courses? Because what we see from the school, it's like you're going to go and you're going to learn literature and history and science and all of those basic things, but we don't see Chilton having any sort of those elective courses or more specialized courses offered to their students. And for even some, I think of like Brad, who, if Chilton offers like a dramatics program, he'd probably be the first one there. If there's even just like a political science elective course offered, I could see Paris and probably Rory, but maybe more so Paris, like just diving into that for the knowledge base, but also because it's something that interests them. Do you think Chilton would ever modify their standards in their curriculum to offer that? Or do you think they're so one note as an institution that they're never going to change and that's always how the school is going to be?
That's a really interesting question. I don't see them necessarily wanting to change so much of the content that they offer. I think they are very conservative as an institution, and they will probably hold to that more classical idea of an education where discipline of the mind and study of history and politics, economics, classics, that sort of liberal arts education will dominate their curriculum for many, many years to come. They might update their methods based on, new research or studies that are done that prove that maybe some of their standards or their strategies aren't as effective as they would hope. Because I would imagine that an institution like that prides themselves on preparing kids for some of the best colleges in the world would want to use the highest quality and best validated methods and measures to get the kids there, because it's in their best interest for their reputation to update their ideas about how things are done. But I think when you pay for a school like Chilton, you know what you're paying for. That is the kind of education that parents want for their kids to get them to places like Harvard and Yale. And I don't know that Harvard and Yale are going to, look kindly upon these fancy private schools shifting their focus to life skills, because it's not what Harvard and Yale are for.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this sort of domino effect that wouldn't, I think, hit Chilton or schools like it.
Mm-hmm. That leads me to ask too, do you think that it is realistic or good for parents to be sending their kids to Chilton without the presupposition of them going to an Ivy?
Well, that's a really good question too, because we see that not everybody at Chilton wants that. It's, their parents imposing it on them. Madeleine and Louise being excellent examples. They give up on school before they're done their first year, right? So it's probably setting kids up for depression and anxiety and substance abuse issues and all kinds of unnecessary stressors that will potentially inhibit their success later in life, or at least success in the way that they think success should be achieved. Getting a prestigious job that looks good to the outside world, like a lawyer or a doctor or a researcher. So and it's hard to say because there might be kids who want those spots in that school, but their parents can't afford it. And they're just taken up with students who don't really want to be there and whose parents are just paying for it because it's sort of the socially expected thing for them to do. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I can't fault, like, especially you bring up a really good point in Madeleine and Louise. Like, they're both very bright young women, but I don't think that they necessarily are as, it's not that they're not academically focused, because I believe that they are, but they're not gunning to get into an Ivy League school in the same way that Rory or Paris are. I feel like they would be very content even just getting into, like, accepted to just any, I say any, but just, you know what I mean? Like, even just your, like, even like a semi-prestigious 4-year university, and being content with that, as long as the career path is something of their own choosing, what they want to do. Let's say hypothetically Louise is like, I want to go into fashion design. And so she goes to a 4-year university that has like a specialization and a program that offers that. It doesn't change the fact that she excelled at Chilton and that she is still just, again, just a very bright and intelligent woman. But it doesn't mean that she needs to pursue a career path that, is like a lawyer or a doctor or a nurse or a teacher, or any one of those professions that I feel like society views as like success and more recognized in terms of, oh, you're doing something so admirable. No, go be a fashion designer. Like, do you, but it doesn't change the fact that you still had a really wonderful high school experience and that you excelled in a really wonderful environment and within Chilton. So I understand what Chilton's curriculum is trying to do in terms of preparing students for that, but I think they also need to recognize that might not be every single student's goal. And so they still need to just put forth and instill, like, and just, the education that they're trying to give these kids, but just also let them make their own choices too, in terms of, do the career path that is going to bring you the most happiness. And going on what you said too, don't set kids up for depression or anxiety, or forcing them into a field that is going to make them unhappy if that's really not what they want. It doesn't change their knowledge base or their skill set. It just means that they're doing what is most, like, what is going to make them content and happy at the end of the day.
Right. It's kind of the Elle Woods effect, if you think about it, like she gets a degree in fashion merchandising from CULA, and then she goes to Harvard. It's sort of the normalization of a different path, or something that looks unconventional. And, we see how bright she is, and just how good at solving problems she is, and how tenacious she can be when she wants something. And her getting a fashion degree, it doesn't sound as prestigious, but she gets a 4.0 and she gets into Harvard, and she proves herself as someone who has what it takes to be successful. And so I think she's a good example of how that sort of classic conservative path that we think of, private school, Ivy League, lawyer, doctor, is kind of limiting.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can be a success in life without the, frankly, classist BS ideas about what a prestigious career is, or what's an acceptable career path for somebody who is smart. I think everybody has a different set of talents and multiple intelligences that could be brought to any number of fields that could make the world a better place. And it doesn't have to just be a singular idea of success based on how much, like, how high of a salary your job typically has, like, what the entry level salary is.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. I'll ask one more question before I want to move us on to someone I have in mind on the show. Do you think that a gap year between secondary education and college or university is good or bad? And following up on that, is it something that maybe should be mandatory for people before they enter into university? Should that be something that is not optional, that a year off is required for the thought that it allows in terms of picking a career path and declaring a major?
That is an intriguing thought. I kind of like it. I think the research bears itself out that waiting a little bit and thinking about it, getting some real world experience is good for people. It gives them a stronger sense of themselves outside of the strictures of school and allows them to step forward with confidence that what they're doing is actually what they want to be doing. And so a mandatory gap year could be a really interesting opportunity for students to, like, maybe the high school has a setup where students are placed as, interns or co-op students in a field of interest, or maybe they rotate through fields of interest so they can earn a little money. So maybe they're not coming out with as much debt. That could be a thought. And they could be dipping their toes and testing the waters in careers they think they might enjoy. And then they can choose to pursue more education from there if they determine that's the field that they actually want to go into. Because, I went into university wanting to do international relations. That was my goal. I got into a few programs that were specifically international relations, but I ended up going to UBC where they don't have a program for that. They have general political science, and you can sort of, specialize or go into international relations from there if you so determine to subspecialize. But going into the more general program, I learned that I actually preferred local politics. And so the ideas I had when I was 18 and idealistic ended up not being what I wanted later. And I also thought that I might want to be a lawyer. I am supremely interested in the law, but I realized I didn't want to be a practicing lawyer. And perhaps if I had gotten a job at a law firm when I was 18 as sort of an entry level co-op student, I would have known that litigation practice was not for me early on, so that I could tailor my educational pathway to accommodate for that. And, maybe I wouldn't be in my 30s being like, should I go back to school to be a paralegal now? Because, this seems like more of a good fit for me. So I do not regret my university experiences whatsoever. I loved my school. I took a lot of really interesting courses, and I feel like I came out a smarter person just because of the way that school taught me how to think. So I don't regret going to university, but I might have had a more direct path and not meandered so much through my 20s through a variety of different things if I had taken a gap year to learn and work, not to mention I wouldn't have come out with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. So I like that idea.
Yeah, it's interesting. It might, I think it would, I think it would inevitably have to change the university application process in terms of when you can apply, how long they'll hold your admission for. Are you still able to apply as a junior or a senior? If you're granted admission, can you put that admission on hold for a year if you're not ready or willing to start right away? Or even if it did become mandatory, would universities say, yes, you can still apply as a junior or a senior, even though we're not going to actually be admitting you and you're not going to start your education here for another 2 or 3 years? Schools might not want to do that. So it's a tricky thing to say, but I am absolutely also all for a gap year, whether it's mandatory or not. Like, kids coming out of high school are 17, 18. That is not the time to just make really hard and fast decisions about what you want to be doing in life. That's where you should be considering what actually interests me. What do I want to pursue? And if you need to take the better part of a year to really do some introspection and, yes, like you said, maybe intern somewhere and figure out what do I want my life to be in terms of my career path, it will allow you to go forth into your 20s just, I think, with even just a better sense of like happiness and well-being, just knowing that I've took the time to consider what I want my future and my life to look like, and I didn't just jump into a field that is not going to interest me because it was what my parents or society expected of me. or it was because, I felt pressure to do so for myself because a year off just feels lazy. Just for so many reasons, yes, take the time to figure out what you want to do. You have your whole life ahead of you after coming out of high school to to work and make money. So a year to, just figure out what you want your life to look like, I think is a really wonderful thing. And I wish more people did it. I wish I had done it. Hindsight's 2020, but maybe that's just a really good goal that we can have for future generations.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating thought experiment. And I want to come back to it potentially when we talk about university application and or experiences, because it might have an interesting knock-on effect on the age and average age of the university population, and how that might impact socialization and alcohol consumption, and all these other things might be impacted by it. And that's going to take a little more time for me to consider all the ramifications of. But I think on the whole, it seems like a good idea to get kids in the workforce a little bit before school so that they know what it's really like out there. And I think college guidance counselors might be the perfect avenue for kids to like be placed in a position or a firm or a company or whatever that is a good fit for them. And so to have that sort of like high school to workforce nexus built out a little bit is probably beneficial to a lot of people in a lot of different fields. And so I'm going to have to sit with that question for a while and maybe come back to it, because I think it's fascinating. And I guess one more question I had that's sort of related to this. What do you think would have happened if Rory took a gap year?
That is a really, really good one too. I think she might have changed majors. I could even see her departing entirely from journalism if she had just been given the time to consider other career paths. But I think that was so, like, it was instilled in her, but it was also somewhat her own choice to want to pursue that. But had she been given the time off, I could see her coming to the realization that, first off, at the time that this show was airing, it wasn't as severe as it is now in terms of the departure, but print journalism is not now what it was when this show was airing, or even in the 80s and the 90s. It still exists, but it's not as much of a go-to for your average individual who's just waking up every single morning and walking out to their driveway at 6 a.m. to pick up a copy of the paper. Most of the time now, that sort of consumption is happening from digital journalism, just from watching the news on TV. There's definitely been a decline in that. So she might have even at the time just realized, this is potentially a field that is not dying, but is declining. So my expectations and my the odds of me being successful here are a bit diminished, not because I'm not skilled, but just because there's not as much of a demand for it anymore. And she could have taken that time to see and consider what some of her other strengths are. We've said this before. I think Rory would make a wonderful teacher. I could absolutely see her in a school system just educating the youth. So that's something that she might have considered with the time off. But yeah, to now give you a short answer to your question, I would see her changing career paths had she been given a year off. And I still think that she would have wanted to go to an Ivy League school, whether it was Yale or any one of the other ones that she got into. But I think her career path would have changed. And I think it would have actually been beneficial for her to have that happen.
Interesting take, because when she does the internship for the Stamford Eagle Gazette, she loves working at a daily, and she's still in school, and she's like, oh, I love it here, and she tries to get a job there after the internship, even though they don't really have much to offer her. and she reads the Vanishing newspaper in 2000, I guess that would have been 2007. And so she knows that print journalism is starting to struggle by the time she's graduating from Yale. So I don't know if it would have changed her mind so much as a year off from school in general, a year off from the constant striving of high school, and especially a high school like Chilton, going directly from that to the striving of Yale, it might have offered her some different perspective on life, maybe as opposed to her job. And so I would be interested to see how that would have impacted her. I don't know if it would have changed her mind from journalism because she was just so set on it. I wish it had. I don't know if it would have. But I think entering the workforce or just spending some time not being a hyperachiever in an academic setting might have given her some perspective on the world that the rarefied experience of fancy prep school and Ivy League education just couldn't offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
All right. Yeah. Let's move on to my next question, which is education the great equalizer? Does it actually offer the social mobility that it promised? Why or why not?
In previous decades, I would have said yes. That's not the case anymore. And that stems from just, more women are going to school these days and pursuing secondary and just secondary education and going to college and universities and getting into career fields and life paths where you think the 50s and 60s, most, not all, but like most women were housewives, were stay-at-home mothers. There's been a rise in how many in the percentage of women who are now becoming, or receiving a doctorate or a bachelor's degree or even an associate's, and just even continuing on with education after high school. But it doesn't always. I'll say that's a wonderful thing first and foremost. But I think, regardless of gender, I don't think that education is allowing for that sort of mobility in the way that it did in decades past, where you can still go to a 2 or a 4-year school now and receive a degree, but it's not necessarily a guarantee of the job that you want. And even if you do get an entry level position, I think it's harder to work your way up now than it was in the past. Again, there's probably reasons for that too, in terms of just, our population has risen significantly, like over the past, like just, we've gained 1 billion people on this planet over the past 15 years. So there's just more competition for the same jobs. But I just the competition that's there too, I don't think it allows for that sort of that social status and that mobility and that success, because the bar is always going to be raised higher and higher and higher as time goes on. So it's not that the bar is staying set where it is and you can just continue to try and meet it and then overcome it. I feel like it's just always being raised higher to where you constantly just have to work to try and reach it and try and grab it. And the standards for getting to that point just become so increasingly difficult. Again, on top of, inflation, everything else like that. There are so many reasons, but no, I don't think it allows for that social mobility, because you can have like a really wonderful job and come out of school with a wonderful degree, a great GPA, excellent qualifications, and still struggle financially and not have society be viewing you as an upper class or a successful individual because you're not living in, a mansion and you're still just in a starter home, or just it's harder to get there these days. So no, I don't think the economy, especially the economy, I just don't think it allows for it anymore.
I would agree with all of that, and would also go so far as to say that not only is education not anymore the great equalizer, but it's the way the system is set up now actually further entrenches those economic inequalities, because, you know, most of the people who go to Ivy League schools are either the very upper crust or the people who are like, I didn't actually know this until fairly recently, but when you get into a school like Yale or Harvard, there are no merit-based scholarships. So either you're incredibly rich and your parents can just pay for you to go, or you get almost essentially a free ride. But once you're there, the economic inequalities are still at play. And so you may still not get the kinds of opportunities, both social and economic, that the upper class, I hate using that terminology too. Like it feels so icky to even say.
Yeah.
But you may still not get those same opportunities even when you get a world-class education. So it can certainly do some things, but, you know, there are still entrenched forms of racism and classism at play, even when you've proven your merit at those kinds of institutions. You know, I'm just thinking of the studies they've done that show that people with names that sound Black or Hispanic are more likely to be rejected for job applications than names that sound white. You know, it's just, it's still there. And so education is only one piece of the puzzle. We still have to get over some of these other, you know, social issues before we can even start to approach equality. But circling it to our show that we're talking about, you know, how does it impact Rory and Lorelai? Like Lorelai goes to a fancy private school in high school, but then drops out, gets her GED, and then goes on to get an AA degree in business from a community college. And Rory grows up in relative poverty, but goes also to a fancy prep school and an Ivy League thanks to funding from her grandparents. You know, like does it equalize things for them? Do they, like, it's such a weird question to ask about social mobility for people who already come from what would be considered the upper crust of society. You know, Rory says it herself, but I'm a Gilmore. Don't they know that? Don't they know my ancestors came over on the Mayflower? Like, does it have any impact on their situations or their sort of ultimate endings where we see them in the revival with Rory struggling professionally and Lorelai running her own business? Any thoughts on that?
I think it just altered their mindset too much in terms of being spoon-fed and how nepotism can go along with that too. And it really affected Rory so much more so than Lorelai. But the second that Chilton was paid for by her grandparents, the second that she knew that, you know, she was at least going to have money for Yale that was a loan, and I'll pay it back, I promise. I'm going to get a job, and, you know, I'll do installments, and I'll still come to Friday night dinners. Like, maybe that's how it would have gone down. But, like, I think innately too, Rory knew, and Emily and Richard certainly would have just paid for Yale outright had Rory just asked for it, like no strings. I mean, the strings attached were always going to be like Friday night dinner, but even if Rory was just like, even if there was no like payback option, I feel like Emily and Richard still would have just been like, yes, we'll give you money for Yale, just come to dinner. And so Rory was just getting spoon-fed this sort of, not even like, she was just getting spoon-fed privilege and entitlement, and it really sunk into her personality and got ingrained in her in that sense in a really horrific and detrimental way, where she enveloped that mindset that Emily and Richard have always had of just being elitist and feeling like you're better because all of these things are just open to you and offered to you when so many other people don't have that. So I feel like it affected Rory significantly. I don't think Lorelai escaped it fully. I think she definitely did come to rely on Emily and Richard as a fallback when things were not going right financially in her life too. And we see that with her, you know, just wanting to move on from her inn and buy a new retail space and, you know, get new property. But she always knew when she was struggling, even if she didn't want to ask her parents for money, that she could, and that she was always going to have an out there that was available to her. And so many people don't have that. So many people struggle and never are able to overcome those struggles because they don't have that resource. So yes, it absolutely impacted them, and it just made them really, especially Rory, just really spoiled individuals. And I don't love how that affected their personality, and then how they in turn viewed the world. And when there were shortcomings in their life, and when they were failing, or life wasn't falling into place for them the way that they wanted to, they didn't really, like, the reaction to it was not to try and always necessarily look at your own shortcomings and see what I can do better. It's just, no, like, the world is failing me, but it's not of my own doing, and it's not my fault. And I feel like that is also a direct result of just being way too privileged and spoiled.
Lorelai, I think, is a particularly interesting case because she went from privilege to chosen poverty. She chose to run away and not to accept help from her rich parents, and she chose to do it by herself. And I think her attitude to community college instead of, probably Richard would have done to her what he did to Rory with Yale at some point, if she stuck around. So she went out and did it on her own and got a degree. And so she went from being a maid at an inn to being a business owner who by 2016 it's a very popular tourist destination. And you tell even just in, the way she dresses and the way her house looks, that her financial situation has improved quite a bit over the years. Part of that might be Luke and having a partner to share expenses with. But she's doing a lot better financially. So she did have some sort of mobility, but I don't know if it was because of the education. It might have been from the advantages provided economically by her family, and also because because she had job experience. I'm not entirely sure if she actually needed that business degree, because she was getting real life experience in managing an inn by actually doing it in the real world. And if she wanted to buy her own property, she was going to be her own boss. Nobody's going to care if she has a degree. Like, I thought it was just sort of a status symbol and a point of pride to say that, like, I went out and I got this for myself, and I'm educated and I'm a business owner now. I think it was almost more of a social than a requirement for her to climb back from the lower class to the upper middle class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really excellent point.
Yeah.
I want us to jump off of that and transition us into thinking about students like Jess, who were not raised in a privileged sort of sense, for starters, but also just had parents who didn't invest in them, and how that could have impacted, and how I think in Jess's case, it did impact how he broached education in the school system, and how it affected his motivation and his pursuit of career paths that could have been open to him. Because as we see, Jess is a very well-read, intelligent young man. But he doesn't pursue education after high school. Even high school is flaky for him. He cuts class all of the time and chooses to get a full-time job and go to work. So I'll start out with just asking about him. Do you feel like the educational system was failing Jess, or was Jess kind of digging his own grave by making poor life choices?
Oh, column A, little column B, I think, with Jess. He has a very similar background to Rory in that, they both were born to single mothers, and those mothers whether they chose it or not, both lived in poverty when they were young. And they both obviously have a great love for literature. So, a lot of superficial connection between those two. And I think part of Liz's issue was Liz's negligence, because she clearly didn't foster in him a love for education or a belief in the power of education. You can see it in his attitudes towards school. Rory points it out to him that, he reads everything, he remembers everything. He could do anything he wanted, so why doesn't he? And he's like, why don't you ask my mother? I'm sure she could give you a reason. Or ask Luke, or ask your mother. She doesn't know me very well, but I'm sure she's got, an opinion on me too. He was clearly never encouraged the way that Rory was. Rory shouts it out in her graduation speech, just how much Lorelai supported her and tried to give her role models of a variety of types, including literary role models.
Mm-hmm.
So Jess never got that. And so part of it is the system failing him, his mother failing him. And maybe the system also not recognizing his potential. All they saw was a delinquent kid who wasn't showing up to class and wasn't turning in his homework. They didn't recognize that he's actually gifted, And so he was treated in a particular way when they probably should have been asking questions like, what's up here? Because this kid is clearly bright. Yeah. What can we do to support him? What is the gap between like where he is and where he could be? So I think part of it is Stars Hollow, and maybe even wherever he lived in New York, not having the resources to provide him with a more advanced curriculum that actually intrigued him and kept him from being bored. I think a lot of it was his boredom and his just desire to pursue his own passions instead of being forced to be a butt in a seat who just blindly does homework and turns it in because he knows he's smarter than that. And so he doesn't believe in the system to get him where he wants to be or needs to be. And he thinks he can just get by doing whatever. And in a way, he's correct, because when you have that level of natural intellect, you can really pick things up easily and you can sort of carve a path for yourself through experience instead of just education. So he's a unique character on the show because I think he's the only major character who does not complete high school. There are a few others who don't go on to post-secondary education, but I think he's the only one, if memory serves, that doesn't graduate and doesn't go on to some other kind of higher education. Lane goes to Seventh-day Adventist College, even though it's short-lived, and Dean tries out Southern Connecticut State for a while, even though he gave it up after Lindsay's demands. We'll get to that.
We will
get there. But I think the show treats Jess differently than those characters because of his natural intellect. They're not as judgmental of him as they are of Dean. And Lane gets zero crap for dropping out of Seventh-day Adventist College because everyone's like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
Different parks for boys and girls, and you were punished for wearing nail polish. Nobody blames Lane for dropping out of college and never going back. As far as we know, she never continued any education.
Mm-hmm.
And Dean, his dropout is an entire plot line. But Jess kind of disappears and comes back in season 6 and is suddenly a writer. And he's working for a publisher and he's really found his groove. But he never went to college. And so they put Jess on a different level than Dean, I think simply because of some sort of bias toward him for being on par with Rory intellectually. I think they sort of gave him a pass that most other characters who don't go to college don't get.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's a very interesting case study in the writer's perceptions of education and intelligence, because sometimes it seems like they fully adopt the belief that education is the path, but with Jess, they prove the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so at the end of the day, what do you think that Amy and Dan and the writers are trying to tell us? What's the point they're trying to make here? Is education something that we should all be actively pursuing, especially after high school? Are they advocating, do you think, substantially for college and university? Or do you think they're going the other way and trying to instill a belief or throw it out there with their writing saying, you don't necessarily need that and education isn't the end all be all? What do you think their goal is here?
I think on the whole, they are absolutely taking the stance that education is the path, because 99% of the time that is the message. Right from the pilot, we get Emily saying, "An education is the most important thing next to family." And Rory's dedication and her attitudes, and Lorelai's attitude when Rory wants to drop out of Yale. All of these little things sort of add up to give me the impression that they see education as necessary for most people. Jess feels like an anomaly in the ethos of the show. But what I like about him as a character is that he's living proof that that grades and education don't necessarily that like intellect isn't determined by grades, and that you don't have to define yourself by your grades. He's proof that it's too limited a view to attach your worth and intelligence to a letter grade. But everybody else on the show is has that idea and that ideal and path and philosophy shoved down their throats.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think on balance, yeah, that's what the writers are. I mean, sometimes a writer can take a stance that they don't believe in. They could be using it as a vehicle to prove the opposite by showing us what happens when you go down that path, and being so tied to academia that you don't know how to exist in the real world, like Rory. But I think just the tiny little bits of evidence add up to indicate that they believe in education. Like that speech that Rory and Paris are supposed to give together before Paris melts down. All the sort of
Mm-hmm.
the purposes of education and the philosophy of Chilton that flows out of that, and how that's sort of passed on to these characters. I think that is the message. I know Amy says she doesn't do message shows, but like everybody has a bias and therefore everybody has a message. And I think the bias is toward education and away from anti-intellectualism.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying.
No, I would agree that I think that's definitely what this show puts forth. Even when Rory drops out of Yale, which in my mind, like that was her gap year. It didn't happen immediately after high school, but she took one on her own terms when she was feeling just an inordinate amount of stress and pressure from probably taking on way too many classes than more classes than she should have at one time in any one given semester. But when she was feeling that pressure and she was feeling a lot of uncertainty in her life, that was her gap. And Lorelai obviously took issue with it. And I don't even think that Lorelai necessarily was taking issue solely with Rory taking time to herself, but also with Emily and Richard perpetuating it, which was also just gonna make her skin crawl, because it's like, oh, this is something like that my parents and I are once again going against each other on. But I can understand Rory needing the time there to really just breathe, to decompress, to relieve herself of that stress that she was feeling and take a step back, work on her well-being, and then go forth back into Yale, or just even if she never went back to Yale and she had gone to a different university, going forward with a clearer head and a better mindset of what she wanted to do. And I just think in general that allowed her for better success. And I think it allows anyone for better success when you could just take that time for yourself, especially when you're struggling and you're feeling that stress. take a step back.
Yeah, and Lorelai acted like it was the end of the damn world, that
Mhm.
Rory wanted a break from academia. Like, we know that Rory loves school, and we could guess that she would go back because it's this innate drive in her that she has to learn and to grow through her schooling experiences. But just Lorelai's attitude that, like, no, this isn't allowed to happen. I don't know if they wrote that in because they wanted the drama and they wanted the split, or if they also, like, because Rory takes up the idea too with Dean, where it's like a break means you're less likely to go back. And I mean, statistically speaking, they're not wrong. I saw a video in sort of like the research for this episode. It's from 4 years ago, so I don't know what the stats look like now. They might have changed, especially through the panini making things a lot more difficult. But as of a few years ago, only 50% of high school grads went on to college, and of that 50%, 43% never graduated. So anyone who drops out of college is not part of some anti-intellectual minority. They're actually part of a majority of people who are probably being failed by this system. So Dean is by no means alone in his dropping out of school. And so, but Dean is not Rory. And so Lorelai needed to maybe have a little more faith in Rory's intrinsic drive to succeed and to complete a program, but it has to be the right program. And so both of them just take this apocalyptic idea of taking time off from school as if it's the worst thing you can do. So I guess that brings me to Dean. I really want to talk about Dean and that whole situation. Of course I do. You know, he may not even have gone to a 4-year college to begin with, but it was Rory's urging and encouragement saying, you can do more. You're so smart. I believe in you, that encouraged him to apply in the first place. And we don't know if he ever ultimately goes back. But for me, the problem is not so much that Dean dropped out of college. It's why he dropped out of college. And that's getting married too young. And it's funny because I was watching, I forget which episode it was, but I was watching an episode earlier today where Jess says that Dean will make someone a fine doormat someday. And he became Lindsay's doormat. Called it, you know, like, he worked 3 jobs to support their little family and to satisfy Lindsay's ideal of having a townhouse by the end of the year so that they don't have to live in their cramped little apartment. And I don't see any moves from Lindsay to either have employment or education of her own. So it seems like her mom is teaching her some life skills, which, you know, that's good. That's great. Good, grand, great, wonderful. But even a part-time job at the beauty salon, like the where Kirk works, you know, maybe they need someone else for a few shifts. Even a part-time job could have contributed financially to that household. And she still could have had time to learn those other things. And then if they decided to have kids and she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, that's a completely different question. But, you know, forcing Dean to take on 3 part-time jobs and work himself into the ground and quit school that could have set them up for a different kind of future if he had a different educational path was selfish, to say the least, I think. So, you know, Dean may have been able to get a great skill set outside of college and be completely successful in something without the need for it. We don't know. But a college education these days, realistically, is the new high school education. Most places won't take you without one. And so, to a degree, Rory is right about the fact that, like, Dean probably should have finished college if he wanted certain options open to him. We don't know that he did or that he didn't go back or anything like that. But I just don't like how it was his wife's selfishness that held him back from his goals. I mean, as long as they're his goals and he actually wants to achieve them and they're for a purpose, good. Like, but if he's just going to college for the sake of going to college, maybe rethink that. But yeah, I just don't love how that played out. And obviously we see Rory sticking her nose in it and being extremely judgmental about it. And she makes some points, but there are some other things that like where you can just tell that it's her attitude about the necessity of higher education rather than any belief in or consideration of Dean's personal goals.
Yeah, I think it also, I'll just add on again, full agreement with everything you said. I think also too, like, even though she's not in a relationship with Dean at that point, like she still cares about him as a person. They still were able to maintain a friendship after their relationship fell apart. So I think that is just stemming from I care about you and I want to see you be as successful in life as you possibly could be. And I think in order for you to do that, it means going to school. And perhaps in Rory's mind, being a good friend, like sometimes that does mean telling hard truths. And so maybe in her mind, that was just her hard truth had to just be saying to Dean, it's nice that you want to be able to give your wife these things and offer her like, and what she is hoping for in life, but don't curtail your own aspirations to do that. This marriage is about the both of you. So don't make it all about just giving Lindsay what she wants. Go back to school. Do better for yourself too, because I know that you can. So I don't fault her for any of that. I think that's just good looking out for a fellow human being and someone who she had deep care for and compassion for, even though they were no longer together.
I agree with that. Yeah, I think in a way she was within her rights to speak her mind as a friend. And she saw Dean being exploited by his wife. And it's good. Dean needs a job to keep the lights on and to pay for college and all that. So it's good that he's working and studying at the same time. But from what we can see, Lindsay is just sort of like just learning how to be a perfect little housewife without contributing to the household. And, obviously, there is a lot of unpaid domestic labor, but they don't have kids yet. I could see it being completely economically viable for them to have a stay-at-home mother situation in the future, but they're not there yet. And so for her to assume that she can not contribute economically, it just doesn't feel realistic. Maybe it's just us sitting here in 2023 knowing how unlikely to make a single income household work. Maybe things were different in a small town in Connecticut in 2004, but I don't know. And I also think it's funny how when we run into Dean in the revival, he actually kind of seems like he's better off in life than Rory is. He looks
Kind of.
sharp, he looks healthy. He's got a wife and several kids, so he must be able to support them somehow, or him and his wife are able to support them all somehow. He probably has a cute house with a white picket fence somewhere in Scranton, which is kind of what he wants, and that's fine. Like if that's the lifestyle you desire, have at her. Good for you. Wasn't Rory's goal, and she finds herself floundering professionally because I think she put so much emphasis maybe on the wrong things and lost sight of reality somewhere along the way. And so, despite the fact that she was high school valedictorian and graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Yale, that wasn't a guarantee of success. A lot of people think that elitist private education is like a cheat code to success. It's the only way to make it to the top, to be successful in life. But again, that's a very narrow view of success. And so I think she was so tunnel visioned on this particular life path that somewhere along the way she lost sight of what would have actually made her happy and even more successful by chasing something that doesn't exist anymore for her. So I find Dean to be a great case study in how education may not be the path for some people. You can still be comfortable and happy without having, the world's best education. And going to an Ivy League school doesn't make you a better person or entitle you to your version of success either.
Yeah, I I agree with all of that. I do think that Dean, at the time that we see him in the revival, he is living and being more successful in life than Rory is. And that's telling. Rory completed her education at an Ivy. Dean, pursued education post high school. But their paths were very different. They led lives that were, Dean's life was not as privileged necessarily as Rory's was. But at the end of the day, I think it's noteworthy that he is still, at that point, seemingly so much better off and so much happier and content than Rory is. And he is in a much better place. So I will stand by my sentiment that education is important, and I think it is good for anybody to actively pursue, but it doesn't mean that just because you don't go to an Ivy or an elitist college or university that you're a failure.
Yeah, I agree. And there's one more character that I want to touch on before we wrap up in a few minutes here that sort of like brings a few more points home. And that's Luke. Luke does finish high school at Stars Hollow High and is lucky enough to have, well, okay, that's maybe not the right way to put it because it was his father's death that enabled him to have it. But he is, in a way, privileged enough to get real estate for free, which is a massive leg up. And he uses that opportunity to turn his father's hardware store into a diner. And he runs that diner for many years, and it's clearly a profitable and successful venture for him because he's able to earn enough to put away to give Lorelai 30 grand as an investment in the inn, and enough money to put a decent down payment on a mansion, and enough money to renovate Lorelai's house so that they can both live there. He's clearly doing well enough for himself. And the thing that I find most interesting about Luke that I want to sort of tie in with Jess is the fact that Luke went on to be an entrepreneur, and he didn't pursue higher education for himself. And yet he seems to be foisting it on Jess without asking Jess what it is he wants or what he wants to accomplish. All he does is work to put Jess on the path that he thinks he should be on. And Jess even calls him out on it. Like, well, I guess it's more about his dad when he says it, but it makes sense in context of him dropping out of school as well. That's the kind of moment that they have this reckoning, is when Luke finds out that Jess has flunked out entirely. Jess is like, who says that you have the right to determine the path, basically? Like, why is it only your decision? Nobody really sat down with Jess and asked him what it was he wanted out of life or what he wanted to accomplish. And so Luke, someone who's a bit of an anti-intellectual himself, who doesn't care about it or feel like it's necessary for himself, is adamant about it for his nephew. Is it because he thinks Jess is too smart for something else? Or like, I wonder what the deal is there, because you would think that he would favor entrepreneurship and creativity and being your own boss and determining your own path, as opposed to just that narrow view that college is the only way.
Yeah, I mean, I think minutely, and I say minutely because Jess has not been with Luke very long at this point, but I think a part of it stems from that concept of parents are always going to want better for their kids and or the best for their kids. And so in Luke's mind, I think he was obviously very content to run his diner and have that be his business and his livelihood. And he was successful in it because it allowed him to get by and pay his bills and keep a roof over his head and even have money saved away. All good things. But I think in his mind, that's good for him, but it's not good enough for Jess, because I think he does see that, like, Jess is a highly intelligent young man who has the world open to him, whose future can be whatever he wants it to be. And so when he sees Jess settling for less, when he sees the lack of motivation, when he sees Jess not trying, and knowing what he's capable of, I can understand how that's going to not sit right with Luke, because here's my nephew, my flesh and blood, who has so much more available and open to him in life, and the world is his oyster, and he can just, take it and make what he wants of it. And he's not doing that. And so I just think it's just Luke just loving on his nephew in that way and just being like, I want more for you, and you can have more, and go get it, because it's yours to take, and I know you can do it.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think a big part of it was, as you said, Jess's lack of motivation. It wasn't specifically all tied to school. A lot of it was because that was how it was manifesting itself.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he wasn't seeing enough of a drive out of Jess that he knew could be there given his capabilities. But I'm also surprised that as someone who took a path of self-determination in business, someone, he points out to Jess when they're having this fight, he's like, I built this, I'm my own boss. I'm employee of the month. I'm employee of the universe. Like, he clearly values that kind of autonomy for himself in his profession. And the fact that he doesn't even ask Jess, like, what is it that you want? Like, why are you not participating in school? What is it that is holding you back from this? And what do you want moving forward? So I think it would have done better, instead of just trying to force it on him, you should do something in collaboration with him and help him achieve his goals on his terms, instead of assuming that the path must be the one that he sees Rory on, because that's what he says to her when he asks Rory to tutor him. He's like, or it's what he says to Lorelai, like, Rory's on the path I want to see Jess on.
Mm-hmm.
And he needs to see someone he respects doing what he should be doing, as if that's what he should be doing. I think we should be more encouraging of our kids to be creative and to take risks and to start things for themselves. Innovation is what's going to improve the world. And so if all we have is, kids who have been taught nothing but discipline and compliance and conformity, we're never going to move forward as a society. So you need people like Jess, who has the smarts, but who also has maybe some interesting ideas to go out and do their own thing. And we see that Jess does ultimately find something that's really great for him without needing formal higher education.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that Luke and Jess are a cautionary tale in trying to force it too hard.
Yeah, I would agree. Parents, guardians of young adults, children, don't do that. I mean, encourage your children and support them and motivate them to always try and do better and achieve what they're capable of, but balance it also with letting them make their own choices and determining what they want their life and their career path to look like.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think, despite the fact that I have more to say about education, maybe we'll have to come up with yet another episode. Like, we haven't even hardly touched on, the public versus private question. So maybe we'll have to devote an episode to that. But I think you put a beautiful cap on it, and we've been going almost an hour and a half. So we need to cut this. But I think that's just a phenomenal way to lead off.
Yeah, I agree. What do we got coming up next?
Next week, we're going to talk about female friendships.
Ooh, I don't think we would know anything about that.
No, nothing. We're not women who are besties. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting because the show is so heavily focused on women. People point out constantly how frequently it passes the Bechdel test, which we'll probably talk about that and why it's maybe not the end all be all of feminist television either. But the mother-daughter relationship and friendship is not the only focus of the show. There's quite a bit of emphasis on female friendship. And so we're going to dig into Rory and Lane, Rory and Paris, Lorelai and Suki, Madeleine and Louise in Paris, Lucy and Olivia, all of these great dynamics between girls and women, and how the show shows us the importance of that kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, I have a lot of thoughts, so I'm excited for that. Come back and join us for that one. In the meantime, go back and watch some of our old videos if you want more GG content. And just always remember to do the YouTube things for us. Like this video, subscribe to our channel. Really helps us out, and we're always grateful for the support. But in the meantime, enjoy your weekend, and we will see you next Friday night for dinner.
Bye.
Bye.